No dramatic confrontations, just exhaustion settling into everything. Daniel stopped sleeping properly. Melissa cried during some conversations and became defensive during others. Some explanations made sense. Others felt incomplete, like pieces missing from a puzzle nobody wanted to finish. The children grew quieter around the apartment. I stayed mostly out of it because their marriage still belonged to them, not me. Quietly, though, I finalized the Duplex trust. Daniel and the children would have full rights to live there, but the property itself could not easily be sold, refinanced, or leveraged against personal debt without multiple protections in place. When Melissa learned about the arrangement, she did not argue or accuse anyone of betraying her. She just became very quiet and looked emotionally exhausted, like someone realizing a situation had slowly slipped beyond her control, without any dramatic moment marking the change. About a month later, she moved temporarily into her sister's house. Daniel never once spoke badly about her to me afterward, even when he was clearly hurt. I respected him deeply for that. Winter passed slowly after that. On weekends, Daniel came with me to work on the duplex. We painted baseboards, fixed outlets, and replaced old cabinet hinges. Sometimes we talked for hours. Other times, we worked side by side in silence while snow collected quietly outside the windows. One Saturday, my grandson helped me install a porch light near the front steps because he said the old one looked sad. After he went inside, I stood alone in the yard watching the new light spread across the sidewalk. And for some reason, I kept thinking about that storage unit key sitting untouched on their kitchen counter for weeks, while bigger problems quietly piled up around it. That is the strange thing about families sometimes. The real trouble rarely arrives all at once. Usually, it starts with little things people stop paying attention to because life feels busy and exhausting and complicated. A forgotten key, an unopened bill, a conversation somebody assumes they will deal with later. Then one day you realize those small things were warning signs all along. A few weeks after Melissa moved out, Daniel asked me if I thought she married him for money. We were sanding cabinet doors in the duplex kitchen while cold rain tapped against the windows. I kept working for a second before answering. "No," I said finally. "I think fear changes people slowly. Sometimes they get so focused on surviving that they stop noticing what they're becoming." Daniel nodded without looking at me. "That sounds like something Mom would say." I smiled a little and told him his mother usually used fewer words than I did. That was probably the closest thing to a laugh I heard from him in months. Later that evening, after the kids had gone home, we sat eating takeout chili beside the old heater in the duplex dining room. After a while, Daniel said quietly, "I should have paid more attention." I stirred my coffee for a moment before answering. "Trusting somebody isn't stupidity," I told him. "Most people don't realize things are falling apart until they're already exhausted." He looked tired when he raised his eyes toward me. "Still feels stupid." I understood why he felt that way. When my wife got sick years earlier, there were weeks I signed whatever paperwork people placed in front of me because I could barely think straight anymore. Hospital forms, insurance documents, payment plans. Grief and stress narrow your vision. You stop noticing things that normally would have stood out immediately. That does not make you weak. It just makes you human. Before Daniel left that night, he picked up the storage unit key from the windowsill where I had left it earlier that morning. "You probably want this back," he said. I looked at the key for a second before shaking my head. "No," I told him. "I think you should hold on to it this time." After he drove away, I locked the duplex and stood outside for a while listening to distant traffic move through the neighborhood. The new porch light glowed softly against the cold winter dark, and I remember thinking that stability is almost never built through grand moments the way people imagine. Most of the time, it comes together quietly through small, careful decisions repeated over many years, usually by people who are simply trying their best not to lose the ones they love. Melissa noticed me looking at it and laughed softly. "We keep meaning to clean things up around here." I nodded, but the apartment was already clean. Only certain things seemed ignored. A few days after that, I met my accountant Jean for lunch. We had known each other almost 30 years, long enough that conversations sometimes drifted into personal territory, without either of us planning it. Somewhere between coffee and pie, I asked what could happen if inherited property became connected to marital debt. Jean looked at me over his glasses. "That hypothetical?" "Mostly," I said. He shrugged. "Depends how the property is protected." That conversation led to another one, then another. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No shocking criminal history, no secret second family, just paperwork and financial records that slowly painted a picture I did not like. Melissa had several outstanding loans tied to an online clothing business Daniel believed had shut down years earlier. There were balance transfers between credit cards, overdue notices, and withdrawals from savings accounts Daniel once proudly told me they never touched. The amounts themselves were not catastrophic. The secrecy was what bothered me. One evening I sat alone in my garage staring at shelves my wife and I built together 20 years earlier and realized something uncomfortable. Melissa was not acting like some evil mastermind. She was acting like someone scared. Scared people do strange things when they start believing stability is slipping away from them. That realization made the whole situation harder to think about. If she had been openly cruel, I could have simply hated her and moved on. Instead, family dinners became tense in quiet ways nobody else seemed to notice. Melissa brought over soup after work and asked about my knees whenever the weather turned cold. She talked more and more about security, stability, rising costs, and how difficult things had become for families lately. Sometimes I believed every word she said. Other times, I felt like we were standing inside two completely different conversations without admitting it. Meanwhile, Daniel moved through all of it with the exhausted trust of a man trying very hard to keep everyone comfortable. One night, he laughed and said, "Honestly, if Melissa didn't handle finances, I'd still be paying late fees on everything." Everyone laughed except me, because for the first time I realized he truly did not know what was happening around him. That thought stayed with me for days. The duplex stopped feeling like a gift, waiting to happen. Instead, it started feeling fragile, like something balanced between people carrying pressures they were no longer honest about. So I delayed signing the transfer papers. Instead, I called an attorney who had handled property agreements for me over the years. I asked about housing trusts, asset protection, and restrictions that could prevent inherited property from being sold or refinanced too easily. Eventually, she asked, "Is there trouble in the family?" I told her, "I'm trying to prevent some." In November, I asked Daniel to help me clean out my old storage unit before winter arrived. He showed up wearing an old flannel jacket he borrowed from me years earlier and never returned. We spent the first hour moving boxes around and talking about ordinary things: football, school schedules, whether his car transmission sounded worse lately. The storage unit smelled like dust and cold fabric. Near the back were old photo albums and Christmas decorations wrapped in newspaper. Daniel sat on an overturned paint bucket, flipping through family pictures, while I quietly sorted paperwork nearby. Finally, I placed several documents beside him. "You recognize these accounts?" I asked. At first he looked confused, then he noticed Melissa's signature on several loan notices and transfer records. I watched his posture change before his expression did. "What is this?" "I think it's something you should have seen sooner," I said carefully. He read silently for several minutes, while the sound of another storage unit door slammed somewhere farther down the hallway. "She told me the business debt was already handled," he said quietly. "I know." Then I told him about the conversation I overheard outside the apartment. Not dramatically, just plainly. At first he defended her immediately, said there had to be context missing, said stress changed how conversation sounded. Halfway through explaining, he stopped speaking. Not because I interrupted him, because he could hear uncertainty in his own voice. We sat quietly for a long time after that. Finally, Daniel stared toward the storage unit key hanging from the latch nearby and said softly, "I don't even know how much of our life she handles anymore." It was the first completely honest sentence either of us had spoken all afternoon. The weeks afterward were uncomfortable in ordinary ways. No screaming fights. I almost signed the duplex over to my son the same day I realized something felt off. The paperwork was already sitting on the passenger seat beside me, ready to be transferred. After years of saving and building, I was finally giving him the house so his family could breathe a little easier. But when I reached their apartment that morning, I didn't expect what I was about to hear through a cracked open door. That moment changed everything. An hour earlier, I had been on my way to surprise Daniel with the property papers. The folder was sitting on the passenger seat beside me while I drove across town, feeling prouder than I had felt in years. The duplex on Bell Street had taken me more than 2 decades to fully pay off, and I had finally decided it was time to hand it over to him quietly before Christmas. I kept imagining his face when I told him. A backyard for the kids, a garage he could finally use for his tools, a place that actually belonged to him after years of apartment living and rising rent. At 68, you stop expecting many moments that feel like beginnings. But that morning did. The only reason I went over there unannounced was because Daniel had forgotten his storage unit key at my house again. It had been sitting on my kitchen counter for nearly 3 weeks, under grocery receipts and one of my old contractor notebooks. Every time I saw it, I told myself I would return it tomorrow. That morning I finally did. I remember climbing the stairs to their apartment with the key in my coat pocket. In the folder tucked under my arm, their front door was cracked open slightly, just enough for voices to drift into the hallway. I was about to knock when I heard Melissa say, "If we wait too long, repairs are going to eat into everything." I stopped without meaning to. Daniel answered something quietly, but I could not hear him clearly. Then Melissa spoke again. "We'd probably be better off selling it while the market's still decent." I stood there confused for a second because Daniel did not even know I planned to give them the duplex yet. Then she said, "You can't keep thinking emotionally about property like that." Nothing about her tone sounded cruel. That was what bothered me afterward. She sounded calm, practical, like someone discussing plans that were already halfway decided. I stayed there long enough to hear a few more scattered words. Debt, refinancing, timing. Then I walked back downstairs without knocking. The storage unit key stayed in my pocket the whole way home. For several days, I tried convincing myself I had misunderstood everything. Melissa had always been responsible. During my wife's illness, she handled insurance calls when I could barely focus long enough to read paperwork straight. She brought over food after long hospital appointments and stayed late helping organize medications at the kitchen table. You remember those things about a person, which was why I hated how suspicious I suddenly felt. But after that morning, little moments started sticking with me in ways they never had before. At Sunday dinner, Daniel mentioned how nice it would feel someday to own a home where the kids did not have to share a bedroom. Melissa smiled and said, especially if interest rates drop before refinancing gets expensive again. The word refinancing sat in my head all night. A few days later, she casually asked if I had updated my estate paperwork recently. You worked hard your whole life, she said while loading dishes into the sink. It's important to keep those things organized. Her tone sounded warm and completely normal. Still, I noticed Daniel barely looked up from helping my granddaughter with homework while the conversation happened. That bothered me too. About a week later, I stopped by unexpectedly with a box of winter clothes I had found in storage. The apartment itself looked neat, bills stacked carefully beside Melissa's laptop, shoes lined against the wall, sink empty, but Daniel's storage unit key was still sitting untouched on the counter exactly where I had left it.